You know what's funny about being invisible? People think you can't see them either. Those words still echo in my mind every morning when I look in the mirror. Not because I'm rehearsing some motivational speech, but because they represent the exact moment I decided to stop apologizing for taking up space in a world that seemed determined to erase me. My name is Celeste Winters, and this is the story of how I went from being society's afterthought to becoming the woman they couldn't ignore, no matter how desperately they wanted to. But before I tell you about the boardroom conquests, the standing ovations, and the moment I walked into a room and watched my former bullies scramble to introduce themselves, let me take you back to where it all began. Because the truth is, my story doesn't start with success. It starts with a 17-year-old girl sitting alone in a high school cafeteria, invisible to everyone except when they needed someone to mock. High school has a special way of teaching you your place in the world's hierarchy. For some people, it's at the top, surrounded by friends, admired by teachers, destined for greatness. For others, like me, it was a masterclass in learning how to disappear. I wasn't bullied in the traditional sense. Nobody shoved me into lockers or wrote cruel things on my social media. What happened to me was somehow worse. I was systematically ignored. I existed in the spaces between conversations, in the gaps where laughter died, in the uncomfortable silences that followed whenever I tried to contribute to group discussions. My mother used to tell me I was quietly brilliant, which I later realized was adult speak for smart but completely unmarketable. I had straight A's, perfect attendance, and absolutely zero social presence. Teachers forgot my name despite having me in class for entire semesters. Classmates looked through me like I was made of glass. The worst part wasn't the isolation. It was the realization that people had collectively decided I didn't matter. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but with the casual indifference reserved for background noise. I was human wallpaper, present but entirely unremarkable. I remember sitting in advanced physics, the only class where I felt somewhat competent, when our teacher announced we'd be working on group projects. The familiar dread settled in my stomach as I watched classmates immediately turn to their friends, forming alliances with the speed and efficiency of seasoned diplomats. I sat there, pen poised over my notebook, waiting for anyone, to make eye contact. Nobody did. Eventually, Mrs. Patterson had to assign me to a group of 3 popular kids who received me with the enthusiasm typically reserved for root canal procedures. They were polite enough, sure, but their message was clear. I was charity work, a burden to be tolerated rather than a contributor to be valued. During our first meeting, I presented my research, 15 pages of meticulously organized findings that would have guaranteed us an A+. They barely glanced at it. Instead, they spent 45 minutes discussing their weekend plans while I sat there, my carefully prepared contribution growing more irrelevant by the minute. "Oh, that's thorough," Jessica, the group's de facto leader, said when I finally worked up the courage to interrupt their conversation. The way she said thorough made it sound like a character flaw. That night, I went home and made a decision that would haunt me for years. I rewrote my entire research project, dumbing it down, making it more accessible, removing anything that might make my teammates feel intellectually inadequate. I convinced myself I was being considerate, collaborative, mature. I was actually learning how to disappear. College was supposed to be different. That's what everyone told me. College is where you find your tribe, where intelligence is valued, where the social hierarchies of high school dissolve into irrelevance. What a beautiful lie that turned out to be. I attended a prestigious university, the kind of place where everyone assumes you're brilliant by default. Finally, I thought, I'd found my element. Instead, I discovered that invisible girls from high school often become invisible women in college, just with better vocabularies and more sophisticated ways of being overlooked. My freshman roommate was a stunning girl named Harper who collected friends the way other people collected stamps, enthusiastically and with impressive variety. Our dorm room became a social hub, constantly filled with laughter, gossip, and the kind of effortless camaraderie I'd observed from the outside my entire life. I tried to participate. I really did. I'd contribute to conversations, share interesting articles I'd read, even attempt the occasional joke. But somehow, my words seemed to evaporate the moment they left my mouth. People would nod politely, then immediately pivot to more interesting topics. I began to wonder if I was speaking a different language, one that sounded like English but translated to white noise in everyone else's ears. The worst incident happened during my sophomore year. I was taking a seminar on contemporary literature with Professor Williams, a woman I deeply admired for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to academic discourse. During one particularly heated discussion about feminist themes in modern fiction, I raised my hand and offered what I thought was a fairly insightful analysis. The room went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet that means people are absorbing your wisdom, but the awkward kind that suggests you've committed some social error you're not even aware of. Professor Williams nodded curtly and said, "Interesting perspective, Catherine." My name is Celeste. I'd been in her class for 6 weeks. After class, I approached her desk, heart pounding. "Professor Williams, my name is actually Celeste, not Catherine." She looked up at me with the expression of someone trying to place a face they're certain they should remember but absolutely don't. "Of course, I apologize. Celeste." She said my name like she was testing it out, seeing how it felt in her mouth. I wanted to say more, to remind her that I'd been actively participating in discussions, that I'd turned in what I considered to be thoughtful papers, that I existed as more than just a name she couldn't remember. Instead, I nodded and left, carrying the weight of my own insignificance like a stone in my chest. That night, I made another decision that would shape the next several years of my life. I stopped trying to be seen. If the world was determined to treat me as background scenery, I'd become the best background scenery possible. I'd be helpful, accommodating, forgettable. I'd ask for nothing and expect even less. My entry into the corporate world was a masterclass in systematic invisibility. I landed a position at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm with the kind of aggressive corporate culture that chews up insecure people and spits out their bones. My interview was conducted by Janet Morrison herself, a woman whose reputation for brilliant strategic thinking was matched only by her talent for reducing grown professionals to quivering masses of self-doubt. She hired me, she later told me, because I seemed pleasant and unlikely to cause drama. In corporate speak, this translated to, "You appear to have no personality whatsoever, which makes you perfect for handling tasks nobody else wants to do." I became the office Swiss Army knife, useful, reliable, and entirely interchangeable. I wrote reports that senior partners presented as their own insights. I solved problems that other people took credit for. I worked late, arrived early, and somehow remained completely invisible to everyone who mattered. My colleagues were polite but distant. During lunch breaks, they discussed their weekend adventures, their dating dramas, their career ambitions, while I sat nearby eating my sad desk salad and pretending to be fascinated by my phone. They weren't cruel. They simply didn't register my presence enough to include or exclude me. I was office furniture that occasionally contributed useful spreadsheets. The breaking point came during my 3rd year at Morrison & Associates. I'd been working on a particularly complex project involving market analysis for a major client. For weeks, I'd pored over data, identified patterns, and developed what I believed to be groundbreaking insights that could save the client millions of dollars. My direct supervisor, Richard Hartwell, was scheduled to present my findings to the client. The day before the presentation, he called me into his office. "Celeste," he said, not looking up from his computer screen, "I've reviewed your analysis and I think it needs some refinement." He proceeded to explain how he was going to present my work, with significant modifications that would make it less challenging, less innovative, and significantly less accurate. When I tried to explain why these changes would fundamentally compromise the integrity of the analysis, he held up his hand. "I appreciate your attention to detail, but you need to understand that client management is more nuanced than you realize. Sometimes we have to prioritize relationship building over being technically correct." I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that being technically correct was literally our job. Instead, I nodded and returned to my desk, where I spent the next hour watching Richard butcher 3 months of my work into a presentation that would ultimately cost our client a fortune. The presentation was a disaster. The client, who was nobody's fool, saw through Richard's watered-down analysis immediately. They terminated their contract with Morrison and Associates within a week. At the post-mortem meeting, Richard blamed insufficient data analysis for the failure. He never mentioned my original recommendations, which would have addressed every concern the client raised. I sat in that conference room, listening to him systematically erase my contributions to the project, and realized something profound. I wasn't just invisible anymore, I was actively being disappeared. That evening, I went home to my small apartment and sat in my kitchen, staring at a bowl of cereal I didn't have the energy to eat. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my frustration. Not just about Richard, not just about the failed project, but about the entire trajectory of my life. I was 26 years old, highly educated, professionally competent, and completely insignificant. I had somehow managed to live more than a quarter century without leaving any meaningful impact on the world around me. I was a ghost haunting my own existence. But as I sat there in my quiet kitchen, something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was desperation, but I found myself asking a question I'd never dared to consider before. What if the problem isn't me? What if the problem is that I've been playing a game with rules designed to ensure I lose? What if I've been so busy trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me that I've forgotten to create my own space? I stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, doing something I hadn't done since college. I wrote. Not a work report, not a professional email, but a raw, honest assessment of everything I'd observed, learned, and quietly endured over the past several years. I wrote about the patterns I'd noticed in client behavior that everyone else had missed. I wrote about the systematic inefficiencies in our company's approach to problem solving. I wrote about solutions that nobody had asked for because nobody had thought to ask me. By dawn, I had 47 pages of insights, strategies, and innovations that represented years of careful observation from the perspective of someone everyone had overlooked. And I realized something that would change everything. Being invisible had given me a superpower I never knew I possessed. I could see clearly because nobody expected me to be watching. Monday morning, I walked into Morrison and Associates with a new sense of purpose. I didn't announce my transformation with some dramatic gesture or inspiring speech. Instead, I began implementing a strategy I'd been unconsciously developing for years. I started documenting everything. Every idea I contributed that was later presented by someone else. Documented. Every solution I provided that was ignored until a male colleague suggested the exact same thing. Documented. Every meeting where my presence was forgotten despite my nameplate sitting directly in front of the person leading the discussion. Documented. But more importantly, I started documenting my value. I began keeping a detailed record of my contributions, my insights, and my results. Not for some future lawsuit or dramatic confrontation, but because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining my own competence. The data was startling. Over the past 3 years, my analyses had directly contributed to client wins worth over $12 million. My process improvements had saved the company countless hours of billable time. My research had prevented at least 4 major strategic errors that would have cost significantly more than my annual salary. I wasn't just competent, I was exceptional. I simply existed in an environment that had trained me to hide my excellence behind a mask of accommodating mediocrity. Armed with this knowledge, I began making subtle changes to how I operated. Instead of immediately offering solutions when people complained about problems, I waited. I watched them struggle for a while, then casually mentioned that I'd been thinking about their challenge and might have some ideas, if they were interested. Suddenly, people were interested. Instead of volunteering for thankless tasks that would consume my time and energy while generating zero recognition, I started being selective about my commitments. When someone asked me to take on additional work, I'd respond with something like, "I'd be happy to help, but I want to make sure I can give it the attention it deserves. Can we discuss how this fits into my current project priorities?" The reaction was immediate and illuminating. People who had treated me like office furniture suddenly began treating me like a professional with valuable time and insights. The same colleagues who had talked over me for years began actively soliciting my opinions. But the most significant change was internal. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped prefacing my ideas with disclaimers like, "This might be wrong, but," or "I'm not sure if this makes sense, but." I started stating my thoughts with the confidence of someone who had spent years carefully observing and analyzing before speaking. 6 months into my quiet rebellion, Morrison & Associates landed the biggest potential client in the company's history, Meridian Industries, a Fortune 500 company looking to completely restructure their approach to market expansion. The contract was worth more than $15 million, enough to transform our small consulting firm into a major player. Everyone wanted to be on the Meridian team. Partners who hadn't acknowledged my existence in 3 years suddenly remembered my name and expressed interest in collaborating with me. Richard Hartwell, still smarting from his previous disaster, was conspicuously absent from these conversations. Janet Morrison called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. I'd been in her presence exactly 3 times since my initial interview, and each previous interaction had lasted less than 5 minutes. "Celeste," she said, and I was struck by the fact that she got my name right immediately. "I've been reviewing the team proposals for the Meridian project, and your name keeps coming up." This was news to me. I hadn't submitted a proposal or expressed interest in joining the team. "I'm sorry," I said. "Marcus Chen mentioned that you'd been invaluable on the Hartwell project last year. Patricia Williams said you'd provided insights that saved the Richardson account. Even clients have specifically mentioned your analytical work." I sat there, genuinely stunned. For years, I'd assumed my contributions were invisible to everyone except the people who claimed credit for them. Apparently, some people had been paying attention after all. "I want you to lead the Meridian assessment," Janet continued. "Full team leadership, direct client interface, complete strategic oversight." I should have been elated. Instead, I found myself asking the question that had been lurking in the back of my mind for months. Why now? Janet leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression of someone seeing clearly for the first time. "Honestly, because I finally stopped listening to what people said about you and started paying attention to what you actually do. And what you actually do is solve problems that other people can't solve, while somehow making it look effortless." She paused, then added something that would stick with me for years. "I built this company by recognizing talent wherever I found it. I'm embarrassed it took me this long to recognize yours." The Meridian project was my coming out party, professionally speaking. For the first time in my career, I was expected to be visible, authoritative, and decisive. The transition was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My team consisted of 8 consultants, including several people who had been with the company longer than me and had previously treated me like a particularly useful intern. The first team meeting was a delicate dance of establishing authority without alienating people whose cooperation I needed. I started by doing something nobody expected. I acknowledged the elephant in the room. "I know this is an unusual situation," I said, looking around the conference table at faces that ranged from curious to skeptical to barely concealed resentful. 6 months ago, most of you probably couldn't have picked me out of a lineup, and now I'm leading the biggest project in company history. I get that it's weird." The honesty seemed to catch everyone off guard. Marcus Chen, one of the senior consultants, actually laughed. "What I can tell you," I continued, "is that I've been paying attention for years. I know this company, I know our clients, and I know what works and what doesn't. More importantly, I know what each of you brings to the table, and I have a very clear vision for how we're going to make Meridian not just successful, but transformational." I spent the next hour outlining my strategy for the project. a comprehensive approach that addressed not just Meridian's stated objectives, but the underlying structural issues I'd identified through careful analysis of their market position, competitive landscape, and internal culture. It was the kind of thorough, innovative thinking I'd been developing in silence for years, finally given a platform worthy of its scope. By the end of the meeting, the energy in the room had completely shifted. People were leaning forward, asking questions, building on my ideas with genuine enthusiasm. For the first time in my professional life, I was leading a conversation instead of hopping for permission to join one. Working directly with Meridian's executive team was a revelation. These were serious professionals who had built their careers on recognizing competence and results. They didn't care about my previous invisibility or my lack of traditional leadership experience. They cared about one thing: could I solve their problems? The answer, it turned out, was yes, emphatically yes. The market analysis I developed revealed opportunities that Meridian's internal team had completely missed. My competitive assessment identified threats they hadn't considered and advantages they'd been underutilizing. Most importantly, my strategic recommendations provided a clear pathway to sustainable growth that addressed their immediate needs while positioning them for long-term success. But the real breakthrough came during my third presentation to their board of directors. I was midway through explaining my recommendations for their European expansion strategy when the CEO, a formidable woman named Elizabeth Crenshaw, held up her hand. "Stop," she said. "I need to ask you something directly." My heart dropped. In my experience, being interrupted by a CEO was rarely a precursor to good news. "How long have you been doing this work?" she asked. "This specific analysis took about 6 weeks. "No," she interrupted. "How long have you been thinking at this level? Because what you've presented today isn't the work of someone who just started paying attention to strategic consulting. This is the thinking of someone who's been observing, analyzing, and synthesizing for years." I took a deep breath, realizing that this was a moment for complete honesty. "You're right. I've been developing these insights for the better part of a decade. I just haven't had the opportunity to present them at this level before." Elizabeth smiled. "That's what I thought, and that's exactly why Meridian wants to offer Morrison and Associates an expanded partnership, contingent on you leading the implementation team." The success of the Meridian project changed everything, but not in the ways I'd expected. Yes, I received recognition, promotions, and opportunities I'd only dreamed about. But the most significant change was internal. I finally understood my own value. People who had overlooked me for years suddenly wanted to take me to lunch, pick my brain, collaborate on projects. Former colleagues who had barely acknowledged my existence were now referencing conversations we'd had years earlier, conversations I'd assumed they'd forgotten the moment they ended. "You know, Celeste," Marcus Chen said one day as we were leaving a client meeting, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" I asked. "For not seeing what was right in front of me for so long. You've been brilliant this entire time. I was just too distracted by other things to notice." His honesty was refreshing, but it also highlighted something troubling. My competence hadn't changed. My insights, my work ethic, my problem-solving abilities, none of that was new. What had changed was other people's willingness to pay attention. This realization led me to a profound understanding about visibility, success, and social dynamics. Most people aren't actively malicious in their tendency to overlook certain individuals. They're simply operating within systems and cultural patterns that have trained them to notice some people while unconsciously filtering out others. The quiet woman in the corner isn't necessarily less capable than the confident man commanding attention at the front of the room. She might simply be operating in an environment that hasn't created space for her particular style of brilliance to flourish. Armed with this knowledge, I made another strategic decision. I wasn't going to wait for other people to create opportunities for me. I was going to build my own platform. I started writing, not internal memos or client reports, but thought leadership articles for industry publications. I began speaking at conferences, sharing insights I'd developed through years of careful observation and analysis. I launched a consulting practice focused on helping companies identify and develop overlooked talent within their organizations. The response was overwhelming. Within 2 years, I was being invited to speak at major industry events, quoted in business publications, and sought out by executives who wanted to understand how to build more inclusive, effective organizational cultures. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching other, invisible, professionals begin to find their voices. Young women would approach me after conferences, sharing stories that sounded remarkably similar to my own early experiences. Mid-career professionals who had been overlooked for years began implementing strategies I'd developed for becoming visible without compromising their authentic selves. I realized that my years of invisibility hadn't been wasted time, they'd been preparation. I'd learned to see clearly because I'd been forced to observe from the outside. I'd developed resilience because I'd had to survive without external validation. I'd cultivated deep expertise because I'd had time to think without the distractions that come with constant social interaction. Last month, I was invited to speak at my old university's graduation ceremony. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of young faces full of hope and uncertainty, I was struck by how different my perspective was from the insecure college student who had once sat in those same seats, desperately hoping someone would notice her existence. In the front row, I noticed a young woman who reminded me of my former self, intelligent eyes, attentive posture, but somehow separate from the celebration happening around her. During the reception afterward, she approached me hesitantly. "Ms. Winters," she said, "I wanted to thank you for your speech. I've been reading your articles, and they've really helped me think about my career differently." "What's your name?" I asked. "Zara Patel," she replied. "I'm starting at Meridian Industries next week in their management training program." I smiled, remembering Elizabeth Crenshaw mentioning their new initiative to identify and fast-track promising young professionals. "That's wonderful. What drew you to Meridian?" "Honestly, your work with them. I read about the market expansion project, and I realized that's exactly the kind of strategic thinking I want to be doing. Plus," she added with a shy smile, "I heard they're really good at recognizing talent, even when it doesn't look like what people expect." As I watched Zara walk away, confidently joining a group of other new graduates, I realized something profound. My story wasn't unique because I'd been invisible and then became visible. My story was unique because I'd learned to transform invisibility into insight, isolation into innovation, and overlooking into observation. Today, I run a consulting firm that specializes in organizational transformation and talent development. My team consists largely of brilliant professionals who were previously overlooked, underestimated, or underutilized in their previous roles. We've worked with dozens of Fortune 500 companies, helping them identify blind spots in their culture and unlock potential they didn't even know they possessed. The work is deeply satisfying, not just because it's professionally successful, but because it addresses the systemic issues that created my own early struggles. Every time we help a company recognize a previously invisible employee's contributions, every time we develop a leader who had been written off as lacking executive presence, every time we transform an organizational culture to be more inclusive and effective, we're creating the kind of environment I wish had existed when I was starting my career. But I don't regret my journey, even the painful parts. Those years of invisibility taught me things that no MBA program could have provided. I learned to read people and situations with extraordinary accuracy. I developed the patience to observe before acting, to think deeply before speaking, to build comprehensive strategies instead of pursuing quick fixes. Most importantly, I learned that being overlooked isn't the same as being worthless. Sometimes the most valuable perspectives come from people who have been forced to observe from the margins. Sometimes the most innovative solutions come from individuals who haven't been constrained by traditional approaches to problem solving. The young woman who once sat alone in cafeterias and conference rooms, desperate for someone to acknowledge her existence, would be amazed by the woman I've become. Not because I've achieved conventional success, though I have, but because I've learned to value my own insights, trust my own judgment, and create space for my authentic self to flourish. If I could travel back in time and sit down with that 17-year-old girl in the high school cafeteria, here's what I would tell her. Your invisibility is temporary, but the insights you're gaining are permanent. Every conversation you observe from the sidelines is teaching you something about human nature. Every meeting where you're overlooked is providing data about how organizations really function. Every moment of isolation is building the self-reliance that will eventually become your greatest strength. Stop trying to make yourself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't designed for you. Instead, start documenting what you see, developing what you think, and building what you believe. The world needs your perspective precisely because it's different from everyone else's. Your value isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Your worth isn't dependent on external validation. Your potential isn't limited by current circumstances. The same qualities that make you invisible now, your tendency to observe before speaking, your preference for depth over surface-level interaction, your ability to work independently, will become professional superpowers when you learn how to leverage them strategically. Most importantly, the story isn't over. The chapters where you're overlooked and underestimated are just the beginning. The plot twist is coming, and it's going to be extraordinary. My transformation from invisible to indispensable wasn't a fairy tale with a clean ending. It was a complex, ongoing process of learning to value myself, communicate effectively, and create opportunities rather than waiting for them to appear. There are still days when I feel the old familiar urge to disappear, to avoid conflict, to let someone else take credit for my ideas. The difference is that now I recognize these impulses as learned behaviors rather than fundamental character traits. I can choose a different response. There are still environments where my leadership style doesn't fit traditional expectations, where my approach to problem-solving is viewed with skepticism, where my success is attributed to luck rather than competence. The difference is that now I trust my own assessment of my capabilities more than I trust other people's limited perceptions. The story I'm telling isn't nobody believed in me until I proved them wrong. It's I learned to believe in myself regardless of what anyone else thought, and that self-belief became the foundation for everything that followed. That distinction matters because it puts the power where it belongs, with each individual who has ever felt invisible, overlooked, or underestimated. Your story doesn't depend on other people's recognition. Your value doesn't require external validation. Your potential exists independent of current circumstances. The woman they used to call a nobody became someone they couldn't ignore. But more importantly, she became someone she could respect, trust, and believe in completely. And that, ultimately, is the transformation that matters most. The invisible woman shattered every glass ceiling not by becoming someone different, but by learning to be authentically, unapologetically herself in a world that had spent years teaching her to disappear.